maybe I'll comment on that first. I guess I sort of touched on some of those issues with respect to the divergence accommodation conflict when I talked about presbyopia. And that's a clear situation where an imperfect eye, you might say, might actually be advantageous in dealing with stereo 3D content. I think the situation there is that obviously you need the correct correction so that you are actually focused at the distance to the screen. And of course that's going to be different for different situations. I guess the issue of disparity sensitivity and so on, one of you guys would be better placed to talk about that than me.
Yeah, that's definitely another issue. The fact that many people out there have got imperfect stereo vision, they have stereo anomalies of one kind or another, and the field has a wide range of estimates for the prevalence of that, but in some cases up to 30% of the population have some kind of, or have been said to have some kind of stereo anomaly or outright stereo blindness. One population, of course, is people who had a binocular coordination disorder during childhood. So if they grew up, I mean, the most extreme example is growing up with a squint, and then that may have been surgically corrected so your eyes now point in the same direction, but you may never have developed binocular vision, and then, of course, you won't have stereo 3D. There are all sorts of interesting conditions out there. So I've done some work with a group of children who have a condition called intermittent exotropia, and that's where one eye deviates outwards, but only some of the time. So when they're tired, maybe one of their eyes wanders outwards, but most of the time their eyes are aligned. And that group actually has stereo vision, slightly reduced acuity, but the fact that their eyes are pointing at the same time much of the time enables them to keep stereo vision. But interestingly, when their eye deviates, they don't perceive double vision, like you or I would if one eye turns outwards, would perceive the visual world doubled. So their brains kind of developed a switch to enable them to turn off the double vision there. And we were able to show in the lab, you can put up images with very big disparity where control subjects will see double vision. These kids didn't, they only perceived one. So that's just one example of the sort of weird and wonderful perceptual changes that can occur in the brain. You were talking about imperfect eyes, but I guess I'm widening that to maybe not imperfect, but different brains. So there's going to be a whole wide range of perceptual experience due to different visual development patterns, and I think we're really just only beginning to touch on that.
Truthfully, no. I'm going to reiterate a point that Rob made, and that is that he was talking about depth to combination. I'm talking about this temporal stuff, and it's so dependent on what the scene is. If you're going to very fast speeds, I hope it was clear. I've heard it said in the S3D community that all you need to do is have a high enough presentation rate to match the CFF of the visual system, the highest flicker rate. You can see that's absolutely false. You could have a flicker rate or a frame rate of 100 hertz. And I can create situations where you're going to see motion jitter.
Exactly, that's the reason why I'm asking. Are there combinations where we can work on future systems?
Critically important on speed. It's critically important on what the shutter function is in your camera. It's I didn't talk about this, but it's very important how bright the display is. You guys might have noticed that the flicker rate that was kind of getting rid of flicker for us was a little bit more than 40 hertz, kind of low. That's because our display was very dim. We were doing all these tricks we were doing in time caused the compromise we had to make is to have a pretty dim display. So we lowered the visual system sensitivity. So actually everything is probably worse, much worse, for screens like this than what I showed you. So that's a long-winded answer to say no. I think it's complex, and it's very dependent on what you're trying to optimize. If you're willing to live with things like a long shutter function on your camera that's going to cause some blurring, that helps, right, at high speeds to get rid of the judder. But there are all these, trade-offs that are dependent on what you're trying to achieve artistically. So I don't think I can come up with a rule.
It's a great question, and I think that, to my knowledge, the answer is no. There hasn't been formal research. There's anecdotal evidence that you can. The key, there's a deep question that you've asked. There's lots of things you might say about it. There's a whole raft of things we didn't really talk much about today, which is how distorted scenes look when you're in the wrong place, and that problem's a lot worse with stereo scenes than it is with normal 2D movies and pictures, and Marty's done a lot of work on this. So there's a question about whether you can learn to interpret that sort of intended geometrical structure of stereo scenes better when you've had more practice. It's also very relevant to this accommodation divergence conflict that I talked about, because anecdotally, again, it seems that you can learn to decouple these things. I think the key question is whether you end up in a situation where you can sort of switch modes, where you can still walk around the normal world with them coupled as they ideally should be, because responses are faster and more accurate when you do that. And then when you switch into the stereo 3D world, you're able to then decouple them. That'd be great. But if you spend large amounts of time in the world where they need to be decoupled, there might be short-term after effects when you go back out you walk out of the movie theatre into the street and try and cross the traffic. And there's certainly some research ought to be done there to look at those kinds of effects.